Hello and welcome to this Catalan Cymru video, which is going to walk through some PISA type questions that'll help you to get used to the types of questions that appear in the PISA tests and get some practice. These slides will focus on reading skills using several pieces of text and infographics to do so. It is usual for questions in the PISA test to set questions based on several different pieces of reading materials or infographics as you go along. Now, as we go, make sure you pause to have a go at the question before carrying on to hear the logic of the correct response. This question asks you to look at the following information about a journey between Swansea Metropolitan University and Bridgend College. And it tells us that the Jones family are taking their daughter Sue-Ann from an interview at Swansea Metropolitan University to an evening event at Bridgend College. Sue-Ann's mother, who will be driving, has asked Sue-Ann to plan the route and make decisions about the journey. Sue-Ann used an online route planner to plot the family's journey from Swansea to Bridgend and save the following map on her tablet. Now, this is an example of what's called non-continuous text or an infographic. This means that you haven't got a writing, you haven't got an article to read. Instead, you've got something to look at and to extract the information from. So it's incredibly important you just take a couple of minutes to really get to know that piece of information, to just assess, have I looked at every element of it? So the first thing to look at is obviously the route that has been plotted. Now, this route that's been plotted, you can see, goes from, well, it must go from here, Swansea, because it's going from Swansea Metropolitan University to here, although it's not marked as Bridgend, but that must be the end point if this is Swansea, the beginning point. You notice the route as you go, and you'll also notice you've got different colours as you go along it, different symbols. So this is where looking at your key is incredibly important. So you can see you've got direction indicator in terms of the circle. These are where there'd be a separate direction to take, a separate junction to take or something like that. The orange is where there's speed restrictions. So this is along this section here, which is interestingly labelled just next to it, the M4. The green is the route, and this kind of red dot refers to where there are roadworks. Now, interestingly, if you look really carefully, you can see actually underneath here is normal road. Underneath here, there's roadworks and speed restriction as well, because it's orange underneath it. And finally, you've got this little bit of information at the top here. You've got that this is a route clearly for a car. The distance in total is 24.8 miles, and the length that this journey should take is 40 minutes. It doesn't tell us any more about that. What about these speed restrictions? Is that with or without these speed restrictions? Is that with or without these roadworks? But nonetheless, it gives you another bit of information that's important to know. So the first question asked here is, name the 4 places that the Jones family will pass through on the route between Swansea Metropolitan University and Bridgend College. Now, this is a free fill element. So what it means is you would fill in, you would type into this box what your answer is. So it's not multiple choice, it is instead free fill. So 4 places. The first thing you must do is you must make sure you've got 4 places. If you've only got 3, you're not going to have enough. If you've got 5, then you've also gone wrong somewhere. Second, and this is where it's really worth reading that question in detail, will pass through. So it's got to be somewhere they'll actually drive through, they'll actually pass through. So it's got to be on this highlighted route. It can't, for example, be Maes Teg up here, which is nowhere near the route. So what you've got is you have got along this route, tracing it through, first place you're going to go through is Briton Ferry. Second place you're going to go through is Port Talbot. It's labelled on the map. Third place is Pyle, and 4th place is Lalliston. Now, what's incredibly important to do is to type these into the box, but also to type it directly as you've seen it. Britain Ferry has got a capital B for the Britain, and it's got a capital F for the ferry because it is two words. So write it as it is displayed on the piece of information. Exactly the same for Port Talbot. It's two words with a capital P for port and separate word capital T for Talbot. Now don't be worried, if you're saying, well, Britain and ferry, that's two places. No. These, as they're marking it, they will know Britain Ferry refers to one place, Port Talbot second place, Pyle, Lalliston as the fourth place. Now what isn't correct is the start point of Swansea and the end point of Bridgend. Bridgend isn't labelled, so that doesn't really make it too difficult anyway. But it can't be Swansea because it says where they will pass through on the route. The start point is not on the route, it's the beginning of the route. Bridgend is not on the route, it is the end of the route. So paying attention to those little bits of words make a huge difference. Read the question and reread it again if you need to. The map itself then is followed up with a whole series of directions. So it tells us, look at the following information about a journey between Swansea Metropolitan University and Bridgend College. As well as saving the map, Sue-Ann also saved the following directions to refer to whilst her mother is driving. She did this because she knows her mother is unfamiliar with the area and may need step-by-step instructions during the driving parts of the journey. So these instructions then give you, as you can see, from the beginning of the journey, the Swansea Metropolitan University, through to the end, which is Bridgend College. Now you can see, step by step, take Panterkellen Road, Pennegraig Road and North Hill Road to Fabian Way. And you can see this section, 2.6 miles, should take 9 minutes. And here we go. The distance between each of some of these junctions is really quite small, isn't it? 344 feet. 213 feet before having to take the next junction. 0.3 miles, a little bit longer, but still. So each of these little figures here, remember feet refers to, or FT refers to feet, MI refers to mile. Then it tells you, after you've got onto the A483, follow the A483 and M4 to A429 in North Cornley. So part of that instruction then, you've also got 3.5 miles onto the Fabian Way. But look here, you've got 11 miles onto the M4. So 11 miles there where there's no junctions at all. Before then, having to take exit or junction 37 onto the A4229, you're then back onto these little journey times, little distances before then having to take next junction. So just stuff to be aware of. Now note, as ever, all the information that is on the document in front of you. Just because it's in small text at the bottom doesn't mean it's not relevant. In fact, it might be even more relevant. They might be trying to hide it so you don't see it, but actually it is just as relevant, or maybe in some cases incredibly important to a question. So these directions are for planning purposes only. You may find that construction projects, traffic, weather or other events may cause conditions to differ from the map results, and you should plan your route accordingly. You must obey all signs or notices regarding your route. Just bear that in mind. So the question attached to these instructions is as follows. The Jones family are unfamiliar with the area and are driving the route on a dark, rainy evening in December. Which parts of the journey would be the easiest and which parts of the journey would be most difficult? So first things first to note here, this is a two-part answer, isn't it? It's looking for the easiest and it's looking for the most difficult as well. So if you just talked about the easiest, you're only ever doing half what the question asks. If you just talked about the most difficult, again, you're only doing half of what the question asked. So be really clear that you're doing the most difficult and the easiest as well. And then a question ends with justify your answers. Now, a really good way to justify your answer is to say something like, this is because. Now, this gives you a kind of a link into the explanation, the justification of your answer. Now, again, you can see this as free fill, so it's not selecting options. You've got to write in your answers. So make sure that you structure it well. Make sure you start by tackling the easiest or the most difficult. Start with one or the other, maybe even give it a subtitle if you want to, right? All to make it clearer to you as you're answering it, to make sure you do the most or all elements of the question. And also, good structure will make it easier for people reading your responses as well. So, easiest. Well, as we looked through this information earlier, we saw that there were hugely frequent junctions in the early part and actually the later part of this journey. Now, this means that there's quite a lot of scope for taking the wrong junction. So what I'm thinking then actually is the easiest bit, looking at this little information, where you've got 11.1 miles here, where you don't have to think about anything at all. 11.1 miles where you sit on the same road, I would suggest that is probably the easiest bit of the junction. Sorry, the easiest bit of the journey. So what I would suggest then is that the easiest bit is the section along the M4 motorway. Now that's going to be because it's straightforward driving. It's well signposted along this section of the journey, but it's also got the least frequency of directions, least frequency of next junction, take the next junction, take the junction after. Now I'd also say that this information then, if we flip it around the other way, can give us the most difficult element of the journey. So if we're saying the easiest bit of the journey is the bit where there's very, very infrequent junctions, well, the most difficult parts then are going to be this first section before you get onto the M4 and the second or the last section after you get off the M4. Now that's because you're driving on those small urban streets, frequent junctions, 223 feet between taking one junction and say the next junction. And then in my explanation, I'd be making reference to the fact that what we saw in information on our previous slide is that Siwan's mother was unfamiliar with this journey. So if she took one of these wrong junctions, then that would make it even more difficult. And also it tells us here that it's on the dark, rainy evening in December. Very, very easy, isn't it, to miss one of these road names or to miss one of the directional signs and therefore go wrong. So, easiest, most difficult. In the writing of your response, it's important, as I've said, to make sure it is clear and structured. So, the easiest part of the journey would be the section on the M4, what we just discussed a second ago, but writing it for me now. Easiest, I put it in bold, or maybe I'd put it as a subtitle. And then the phrase that begins my justification. This is because. This is because the motorway section has the least frequency of directions in motorway driving, is relatively straightforward, with infrequent and well signposted road junctions. It is a succinct, it is a short, precise summary of what we discussed earlier as to why that is the most important, the easiest. So as you're doing this, you might think in your head, this is the reason why it's easy, this is the reason why it's easiest. But as you're writing, as you're filling in that free fill answer, make sure it is well structured. And then the flip side, remember those two sides of this question, two parts of this question, wasn't there? The most difficult parts of a journey would be the initial section in Swansea before joining the M4 and the final section once the family have left the M4. Again, my sentence starter to really signpost the fact I'm justifying and explaining, well, these sections, or this is because these sections involve small urban road streets with frequent junctions and change of direction. These would be even more difficult to navigate at any time, but even more so at night, in bad weather, and given the whole family are unfamiliar with the area. So I've used all the information available to me in order to make this. I've used the early bit of information that told me that their family were unfamiliar. I've used part of the question that told me it was bad weather and they were driving at night, driving in the dark. I've used the information provided by the infographic, by the piece that they've given you here in the first place. So using every bit of information is incredibly important. The next question says, read the following general statement which does not apply specifically to the Joneses' journey. The journey is 24.8 miles and will take 40 minutes. Is this statement true or false, or could it be either? Justify your answer. So, this is asking you again to reflect on the text. It's asking you whether or not it would be true or false, but giving you the possibility that it could be both. So it's very, very wise to think from the beginning, well, it might be a bit true and it might be a bit false. And remember that classic justify your answer. If you just write, it could be true or it could be false, then you're not doing what the question's asked. You have to justify your answer. Why could it be true? Why could it be false? So I've copied and pasted onto this slide here bits of information from the previous slides that are helpful. In the actual reading section of PISA, you will have access to all that information. It's just a little bit clunky in terms of the PowerPoint. So you can see when we had the map, we had in that top right hand corner, we had that the distance was 24.8 miles and that the length would be 40 minutes, which actually agrees with what is said in that question, suggesting it could be true. This was backed up right at the top of our instructions. It said the same thing, it repeated it in a car, 24.8 miles, 40 minutes. So it could be true because the distance is 24.8 miles and it tells us that would take us 40 minutes. However, there's one bit of information here that means actually there's probably a lot of reason why it's false. And that is this little bit here. Now remember what I've said about paying attention to all of those small little details. This tells us that that length of journey would be with no traffic at all. Now if we remember, they're making their journey, Siwan and her family are making their journey in December at night when it's raining and bad weather. So we've got to think, well, actually, you're going to have probably a few people driving around in the evenings in December in the build up to Christmas. You're going to have dark conditions, poor weather conditions, meaning people are going to be driving slower than they usually would be because they're looking for those signs. Siwan and her family are going to be looking for those signs to pick out all those little directions that they've got, driving slower than they normally would be. So if there was no traffic, it's theoretically possible. Theoretically possible, 24.8 miles, 40 minutes. However, we need to make sure, though, that there's more to it than this. That any traffic on the road would do it. Any unforeseen circumstances would definitely significantly impact that time. Say in all that list of instructions they took one wrong junction, well, therefore, you would certainly put up your time of your journey. So we've kind of brainstormed, and you can do this, you can kind of brainstorm as you're doing this, but then you need to write it up in a coherent, clear way so that the person reading it knows what you're saying, what your point is, what your actual justifications are. So this is what I would say here. We've discussed it, we've thought about it, we've brainstormed it, and we need to put it together. So both the map and the instructions tell us the journey is 24.8 miles and takes 40 minutes. However, the instructions tell us that this journey time would be with traffic, none. So I'm kind of pulling out key bits of information as a statement there, and then now I'm going on to my justification. Therefore, this statement could be true if all other traffic was stopped and the driver followed the national speed limits. If a driver went faster than the national speed limits, obviously they'd be breaking the law, but they would be able to do it in a short time period. If they were going slower than the national speed limits, then obviously they would take longer to do it as well. However, it is also false for any time with traffic, such as daytime with normal conditions. Even if the journey took place at night time, where there were less cars on the road, it may still take longer than 40 minutes to drive due to possible unforeseen circumstances, such as the likelihood of getting lost as the family is unfamiliar with the route and it will be dark as well. So, in my justification, noting what the question has said, it said it's a general statement that doesn't specifically apply to the Joneses journey. I've referred to things that can happen at any time of day. So normal driving conditions during the daytime, because we're not just talking about the Joneses journey, but I've also used information from the Joneses journey to help as well, right? The fact that they'd be doing it in the dark, they'd be unfamiliar, because these are things that could apply to anyone taking this journey. So using all the information that's available to you and doing every element of the question is so incredibly important. This question then asks you simply to locate some information. What does the orange section of the map indicate? So you need to make sure that, as we did at the beginning, we've looked at every element of information, including the key on the map, and then locate quite simply from the key what the orange section means. So we can see that on the map. The key tells us it's speed restrictions, and therefore a very simple question. If you've looked at all the information, C would be our answer. Another simple question here asking you to locate specific information using what's available to you. What would you expect to experience as you drove between Port Talbot and Pyle? So locating Port Talbot and Pyle on the map. Looking at the route, you've got this red dashing, you've got the orange, you've got the green, the red dashing, roadworks. You wouldn't expect to come across them at any other point, and therefore it is D, roadworks. The last question in this section asks you what things would a traveller need to consider beforehand when planning how much time to leave for the journey from Swansea Metropolitan University to Bridgend College. Justify your answer. Now note, read in all the little things, taking into account the little details. What things? That means you're going to need to include multiple, 3 or more things. And also, as ever, justify your answer. Why would you need to consider that beforehand? So, there's a lot to think about here, isn't there? Right? But we're using all the information we've been given to us before, all the answers and the thought processes we've done before. Well, the first thing then, as we've already discussed, is time of day, isn't it? When we refer to traffic, we're referring to the fact, well, traffic during the day is greater. So traffic is one thing a traveller would need to consider beforehand when planning how much time to leave for their journey. Now this is because rush hour, that time of day where there's more cars on the road, would mean that the journey time would take longer, and equally if there was lighter traffic at a different time of day, maybe late in the evening or midday, then that traffic would be slightly less, and therefore the journey time would be shorter as a result. When you're thinking about the time your journey is going to take, also any roadworks. We saw on our map that there were roadworks between Port Talbot and Pyle. Now roadworks cause delays. They cause traffic jams as people are trying to get through those roadworks. This is particularly so if the volume of traffic is heavy. And this then is exacerbated again, isn't it? It's made worse again during rush hour. So actually time of day and roadworks could go hand in hand. If you're trying to get along this journey at 8:30 in the morning at rush hour when there's roadworks, it's going to take you even longer again. And lastly, we saw, didn't we, that Sue Ann and her family were driving when it was raining. Well, local weather forecasts are incredibly important. It's another thing to consider when planning how much time to leave for the journey, because common sense says you drive slower when in bad conditions, when it's raining, when there's high winds, and so obviously the journey time is going to take longer again. So brainstorming is one thing, but creating a coherent response to write, a concise, clear response to write in that free fill box is incredibly important. So it's asked for things, multiple things, isn't it? So what I've done is I've left a space between each of my different things so that it's clear. What I've done is I've also used my absolute classic, our justifying phrase. This is because. This is because. So we've brainstormed, we've thought of ideas, but we need to write it clearly and coherently. So we talked about the time of day. So the time of day the journey would take place. This is because travelling at rush hour could make the journey significantly longer. Lighter traffic would also make the journey shorter. It's concise, it's clear. Any roadworks on the route? This is because roadworks can cause delays and major traffic jams, particularly during rush hour and times of busier traffic. Clear, concise. And third, the local weather forecast for the day concerned. This is because it is common sense to drive slower when conditions are bad, such as rain and high winds, making the journey time longer. Again, it's clear and concise. I waffled a little bit during my explanation. Writing it, I need to be clear and concise. You're more than welcome after you've written it to go back, quickly polish it before we move on to the next question, right? Remember where you see these little bits of information where it says things, multiple. If you just put in one here, you wouldn't have done what the question was asking, for example. The questions discussed in this video are just some that appear in a collection of interactive PISA type questions that are available through Hub. Do go to the Hub website and have a go at some of the other questions that are available there. Simply scan this QR code with your phone or type the long address at the bottom into your browser in order to have a go at some. Good luck.